Imagine the United States government signs a contract to move you into a new home.
Right, a formal, legally binding agreement.
Exactly. So, you pack up your entire life, your family, your community, and you leave. But when you finally get to the new location, the government has already given your new house to a complete stranger.
Oh, man. Yeah.
And when you turn around and try to go back to your old house, a gold miner is standing on your front porch with a shotgun, holding a deed that the government just gave him.
It sounds like some dystopian hypothetical, right?
I mean, completely.
Yeah.
But this isn't fiction. This is the exact legal reality for tens of thousands of indigenous Californians.
It is a staggering historical truth, and honestly, it perfectly sets the stage for the map of California we see today.
Right, because the map we're talking about in this deep dive it's wild. Welcome, everyone, to today's deep dive, by the way.
Glad you're here with us, because if you look at a map of indigenous lands in the state right now, you don't see the massive unbroken blocks of territory that you might see in the Southwest.
Like the Navajo Nation?
Exactly. Instead, what you see is a geographic landscape that is just completely shattered. It is dozens upon dozens of tiny fragmented dots scattered all over the state.
Yeah, if you've ever driven up Highway 101 or, through the Central Valley, you have probably passed a dozen of these signs.
The little brown ones?
Yep, the little brown signs reading Rancheria, pointing off to a tiny sliver of land tucked behind, like a massive corporate vineyard or a sprawling subdivision.
And you probably just thought it was a geographical quirk.
Right. But today, we're going to look at the brutal, calculated math behind how those signs actually got there. We've got an incredible stack of sources today.
We really do. We're pulling from historical dossiers, records of congressional acts, federal reports.
And detailed census data, all chronicling this pivotal window of time between roughly 1900 and 1934 in California.
And our mission today is to unravel a massive historical paradox.
Let's lay that out for the listener.
So we are looking at a campaign that was aggressively pitched to the American public as a charitable reform movement. The stated goal was to buy land for quote-unquote homeless California Indians.
But as we dig into these sources, we really have to ask a deeply uncomfortable question.
Right. How did this supposedly benevolent effort inadvertently, or perhaps very deliberately, create a system of cheap, calculated containment?
I mean, that's the core tension here. We're going to explore whether the creation of these rancherias was an act of genuine charity, an act of containment, or some incredibly troubling mix of both.
And to really grasp the policy, we can't just look at the laws.
No, definitely not. We first have to understand the human reality on the ground. We need to understand the crisis that this policy was allegedly trying to fix.
Exactly. We have to start with the origin of this homelessness.
Right, because the era's own vocabulary use the terms homeless and landless California Indians.
You have to just sit with the sheer weight and irony of that phrase. These were people who were homeless in their own ancestral homelands.
It sounds impossible on its face. I mean, how does an entire population with complex societies and thousands of years of stewardship suddenly become squatters on the very land they've lived on for millennia?
To understand why, we have to look back just a few decades prior to our main timeline, specifically to the years 1851 and 1852.
Okay, the Gold Rush era.
Exactly. California had just become a state in 1850, driven by the explosive population growth of the gold rush. And during this chaos, representatives of the United States negotiated 18 treaties with various California tribes.
18 separate treaties.
Right.
Yeah.
And those treaties promised roughly 8 million or potentially even more acres of land to be set aside perpetually as reservations.
8 million acres. I mean, that is a massive, substantial land base. That's the kind of clear, large block map we were talking about earlier.
Right. If that had held, the entire geography of California would look fundamentally different today.
But it didn't hold.
It absolutely did not.
Yeah.
Here's the devastating twist. The United States Senate refused to ratify those 18 treaties.
Wait, they just refused after the tribes already agreed?
Yes. They were negotiated in good faith by the tribes. They were signed. The tribes actually began moving to the designated areas.
Leaving their other lands behind.
Exactly. But the treaties were killed in Washington. State politicians in California, backed by furious miners and agricultural interests who wanted access to every single ounce of that land, they pressured the Senate.
Of course. Follow the money.
Right. So the Senate not only refused to ratify them, but they placed the treaties under an injunction of secrecy.
Wait, what does that mean practically?
It means they hid them in a drawer for 50 years.
Wow. So the tribes have already given up their ancestral territory based on a promise, but the promise is secretly shredded.
That is the bait and switch.
And they had no idea.
None. And it actually gets worse.
Of course it does.
In 1851, Congress passed the California Land Act. This act required everyone in California to present their land claims to a federal commission within 2 years.
Okay, but I'm guessing the indigenous populations weren't exactly reading the Federal Gazette.
Exactly. They were not informed of this requirement, nor were they participating in the American legal system in a way that would allow them to, hire lawyers and file federal land claims.
Right, they just signed treaties that they thought secured their land.
Exactly. So because they didn't file claims, the federal government legally declared their ancestral lands to be the public domain of the United States.
Oh, wow. So it's just open season.
Yep. Consequently, non-Indian homesteaders and ranchers just flooded in.
They claimed the original ancestral homelands, and they claimed the lands that had just been promised in those unratified treaties. Everything was gone.
Everything. So by the early 1900s, the period we are focusing on for this deep dive, the demographic reality was stark. According to the sources, only about 1/3 of California Indians lived on any reservation whatsoever.
Which means 2/3 of the population, tens of thousands of people, had literally nowhere that was legally theirs.
Yes, the vast majority were entirely landless. They were surviving by squatting on the fringes of white towns, living in ravines, or clinging to the margins of massive ranches.
Just scraping by.
Right. Often they were forced to work as seasonal, highly exploited labor on the very lands their families had stewarded for generations.
I mean, this is the human fact we have to anchor ourselves to today. This wasn't some abstract, distant legal grievance.
No, not at all.
This was tens of thousands of survivors of incredible violence, displacement, and disease who were quite literally starving on the edges of a booming, wealthy California economy.
Absolutely. And to really lock this in, we need to look at one specific micro-history.
Yeah, let's do that. We have a case study in our sources today.
Right. One transaction that acts as a perfect case study for this entire era and shows exactly how the government responded. Let's talk about the Elam tribe at Clear Lake.
Sometimes referred to in the records as the East Lake Purchase, right?
Yes. The Elam Purchase is a quintessential example of how this homeless Indian problem was ultimately addressed by the federal government when they finally decided to act.
So the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA, stepped in to buy land for the Elam people to give them a permanent home.
They did, but let's look at what they actually did.
Yeah, here's where we need to look closely at the numbers. Because the government stepped in, sure, but the math is wild. The government bought exactly 88 acres, spread across 4 parcels, to be the home for 134 people.
Let's let those numbers settle for a moment. 88 acres for 134 people.
Wait, I need to challenge this immediately. Because I'm looking at these numbers and the math is just horrifying.
It is.
If you have 88 acres and 134 people, that equates to about 2/3 of an acre per person.
Barely enough room for a house, let alone a farm.
Right. In the early 1900s, even a poor white homesteader was legally entitled to 160 acres for a single family under the Homestead Act. How on earth did the government or anyone accept less than 1 acre per person as a viable solution? How is a community supposed to survive, farm, find fresh water, build homes, and sustain themselves on a fraction of an acre of marginal dirt?
You've hit on the exact paradox we are exploring today. The transaction details for this purchase are meticulously recorded in our sources. Lake County was paid $6,600 in gold coin to clear the title for those 88 acres.
So the government spent real money.
They did. They stepped into the local economy and created a literal, legally protected space for these 134 people to exist without being chased off by a sheriff for trespassing.
Right, so technically it's a home. It's better than being hunted or evicted.
Technically. But what's fascinating and, deeply disturbing is how perfectly this specific purchase encapsulates the entire federal mindset of the era.
How so?
Well, it provided a legal right to exist on a piece of land, yes, but the parameters of that existence were designed to be as cheap and as small as legally and physically possible. It was survival, but just barely. It was a space to breathe, but it was absolutely not a space to grow or thrive or build economic power.
So if Washington had absolutely no incentive to fix this, if they were perfectly happy letting indigenous people squat on the margins of ranches, who actually forced their hand?
That is the crucial question.
Because the government doesn't just wake up one day and decide to spend $6,600 in gold coin organically.
No, they certainly don't. The push to buy these rancherias did not originate from within the federal bureaucracy. It came from a very specific and frankly complicated coalition of outside reformers who forced Washington to look at the numbers.
Let's introduce them.
We have to talk about the Northern California Indian Association, or the NCIA.
The NCIA, founded in 1894. And to understand them, we really have to look at their sociology. This was an organization that grew out of Protestant women's home missionary networks.
Exactly. These were predominantly middle-class or wealthy white women who viewed themselves as moral crusaders.
Right. And a key figure here is a woman named Cornelia Tabor.
Yes. She became the leading publicist, the sharpest writer, and really the primary strategist for the cause of the landless Indians of California.
They began publicizing the horrific conditions of the squatters, right?
Yeah, they lobbied local politicians, they wrote impassioned pamphlets, and eventually they aimed straight for the top of the federal government.
I mean, in 1903, the NCIA actually petitions President Teddy Roosevelt directly about what they called the thousands of homeless Indians.
They went right to the top.
And on the surface, this sounds like an incredible act of historical allyship. They're using their considerable political and social capital to demand the President of the United States look at these starving people.
It does look like that on paper.
But knowing the history of late 19th century missionary work, I really have to ask about the underlying motives here.
A fair question.
Were these reformers driven by genuine, pure empathy? Or was this rooted in a paternalistic desire to civilize, assimilate, and essentially manage a population that made their Victorian sensibilities uncomfortable?
That is the essential critical lens we must apply to the NCIA based on the source material.
Yeah.
If we dive into the psychology and sociology of the era, the answer is heavily nuanced.
It usually is.
It was genuine moral pressure. I mean, these women were truly appalled by the starvation, the disease, and the squalor they saw on the edges of their towns. They fundamentally believed they were doing the Lord's work by bringing relief. But, and this is a massive qualifier, their charity operated strictly within the confines of what white Protestant society deemed acceptable.
Meaning their charity came with ideological strings attached.
Heavy strings. Their ultimate goal was assimilation.
Ah, there it is.
By forcing indigenous people onto tiny nuclear family-sized plots, the reformers were actively trying to break the communal tribal structure.
So the small size of these land purchases wasn't just cheap.
No, it was a deliberate sociological tool to force them into a Western capitalist model of individual ownership. They wanted to turn indigenous Californians into small-scale, independent, Christian American farmers.
So what they absolutely did not want was to return the 8 million acres of valuable land stolen during the unratified treaties.
Correct. They were not advocating for indigenous sovereignty. They were not demanding that the massive ranches be broken up and returned to the tribes. They were fighting for humanitarian management.
Humanitarian management, that phrase is chilling.
It perfectly describes the tension, doesn't it?
Yeah. They wanted to save these communities from literal starvation, but only by fitting them into a tiny, controlled box of American domesticity.
Precisely. But, you know, to get the federal government to actually open its wallet, the NCIA women needed more than just moral outrage and pamphlets.
Right. Politicians need spreadsheets. They need hard, undeniable data.
Which brings us to the bridge between the moral crusaders in California and the bureaucrats in Washington. A man named Charles E. Kelsey.
Charles Kelsey, a San Jose attorney who served as the secretary and the primary field agent for the NCIA.
Yes. Kelsey is a pivotal figure in this history. The NCIA's lobbying campaign eventually works so well that the Bureau of Indian Affairs realizes they have a massive blind spot.
They realize they don't actually know what's going on out west.
Right. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs needs data to figure out the actual scope of the California crisis. So, in 1905 and 1906, Charles Kelsey is officially appointed by the government as the special agent for the California Indians.
And Kelsey does something that sounds logistically nightmarish for 1905.
Oh, totally.
He conducts a physical, on-the-ground census.
He physically visited 36 counties.
Wow.
Just imagine the logistics of that at the turn of the century. He is traversing the state by train, by horseback, and by wagon, finding these marginalized, hidden encampments on the edges of towns and deep in the foothills, and he is counting the people.
And when he comes back to Washington, his numbers violently clash with the BIA's assumptions.
They really do.
Let's lay out that clash. Because the Bureau of Indian Affairs, sitting in their comfortable offices in D.C., had estimated that there were somewhere between 15,000 and 16,000 off-reservation indigenous people in California.
That was their guess.
But Kelsey's on-the-ground data, He proved that the number was, quote, at least 20,000.
Finding an extra 4,000 to 5,000 people living in absolute unrecorded poverty completely shifted the scale of the crisis.
It's a huge margin of error on the government's part.
It is. Now, we must be absolutely clear here because this is a deep dive into the historical sources, and the sources tell us this is a point of significant historical contention.
Right, let's unpack the conflict in the data. Why do historians argue about this number today?
It comes down to methodology. While Kelsey's effort was monumental, he only physically visited 36 out of California's 58 counties.
Okay, so he missed a good chunk of the state.
Right. For the areas he couldn't reach, often the most remote or rugged terrain, he relied on figures from the 1900 federal census to fill in the gaps.
Ah, I see.
Because of that mixed methodology, combining on-the-ground counts from 1906 with federal census data from 6 years prior, the true, exact number of landless indigenous people at that time remains uncertain.
But whether the exact number was 19,000 or 22,000, Kelsey's core point was undeniable. The federal government was severely underestimating a massive humanitarian crisis.
Absolutely undeniable.
And what's really fascinating is that Kelsey didn't just bring back a head count. He brought back a massive blinking warning light about how not to solve the problem.
Yes, his reporting on the Dawes Act. This is vital context for understanding what happens next.
Let's break that down.
So the General Allotment Act, commonly known as the Dawes Act, was passed in 1887. The sweeping federal policy at that time was to break up communal tribal lands and give individual allotments to Native people.
Essentially trying to force that yeoman-farmer assimilation model we talked about.
Exactly. And in California, many of these allotments were carved out of the public domain.
And Kelsey, in his travels, looked at how that 1887 policy had actually played out in California over the previous 2 decades.
He did. And he reported back to Washington that it was an utter, unmitigated failure.
Really?
Yes. Kelsey found that of the scattered public domain allotments that indigenous people held, only a tiny fraction were actually fit to live on.
Wow.
By 1906, he noted there were roughly 1,797 remaining allotments in the state. And Kelsey documented that about 900 of those, fully half of them, were situated in uninhabitable desert scrub or on impossibly steep mountainsides.
So here is the tragic irony of this entire situation. Charles Kelsey, the man providing the blueprint and the data for the government's new purchasing plan, explicitly saw and documented that giving indigenous people bad, useless land was a complete failure.
He saw it with his own eyes.
He literally wrote down that marginal land meant starvation and abandonment. He knew it. And yet,
bad marginal land is exactly what the government would turn around and buy next.
unbelievable. Okay, let's get into the mechanics of that failure. The reformers apply the moral pressure. Cornelia Tabor and the Protestant women write their petitions.
Right.
Charles Kelsey provides the alarming data of 20,000 landless people. The political pressure builds, and Congress finally, reluctantly, acts.
They do.
But the way Congress chooses to spend its money is what defines the tragedy of the Rancherias.
The congressional response formally begins with the Indian Office Appropriation Act of 1906. For those tracking the legislative history in our sources, this is 34 Stat 383.
Okay, in 1906, what did they do?
Congress appropriates $100,000 to purchase land for residential and agricultural use for homeless Indians of no specific tribal affiliation.
I want to stop and do the math on this because this is where the policy falls apart on contact with reality.
Let's do the math.
Congress pats itself on the back for appropriating $100,000. It sounds like a big number in 1906.
It does.
But Charles Kelsey just told them, emphatically, that there are 20,000 homeless people. If you divide $100,000 by 20,000 people, you get exactly $5 per person.
$5 per person to buy land for residential and agricultural use.
It's an insultingly low number. Giving someone 88 acres of rocks and calling it agricultural relief is like throwing a drowning person a cinder block painted to look like a life preserver and then blaming them when they sink.
That is a harsh but incredibly accurate analogy.
The help itself was the hazard.
Yeah.
The math fundamentally guaranteed the program's failure.
The budget guaranteed the quality of the outcome, absolutely. Now, Congress did follow up. There was another Appropriation Act in 1908. In fact, these roughly annual appropriations for buying land continued all the way through the 1933 and 1934 legislative sessions.
So they were dripping this highly inadequate amount of money into this project for nearly 3 decades.
Just a slow drip year after year.
What did that drip actually buy? What was the physical nature of these purchases on the ground?
They bought what became officially known as the Rancherias. These were incredibly small purchases, commonly ranging from just 10 acres up to a few hundred acres per site, scattered primarily across central and northern California.
But the physical reality of this land, it's deeply troubling, isn't it?
It is. This aligns with what historians in our sources refer to as the wasteland thesis.
Because at $5 a head, you aren't buying prime, fertile California real estate in the middle of an agricultural boom.
Exactly. You are buying the scraps. You are buying the land that white settlers, ranchers, and corporations had already bypassed because it was practically useless.
Makes sense.
Let's look at the findings of the Advisory Council on California Indian Policy, or the ACCA. This is a much later policy body that reviewed the long-term history of the rancherias.
What did they find?
They concluded that many of these rancherias purchased with that congressional money did not provide proper home sites, they lacked irrigable land, and crucially, they lacked a reliable water supply.
No water.
No water. In fact, the ACCIP explicitly stated in their reports that several rancherias were virtually uninhabitable due to the lack of a fresh water supply.
Virtually uninhabitable. The federal government used its humanitarian relief budget to purchase land that people couldn't physically survive on.
And we can see this reflected in the macro data from the era. By 1937, federal reports noted that there were roughly 368,000 acres held in trust for California Indians.
Okay, 368,000 acres sounds like a lot.
It does, until you read the fine print. The government's own internal reporting noted that much of it was of poor quality. A slightly later mid-century review found that out of roughly 500,000 total acres eventually held, only about 60,000 acres were considered suitable for irrigation and cultivation.
Wow.
And most of that arable land was actually in Southern California, which operated under a slightly different framework.
So out of 500,000 acres across the state, barely over 10% could actually grow food.
It's a staggering failure.
Now, I know you mentioned conflicting data earlier with Kelsey's census. Do we have a precise, agreed-upon number on just how many of these tiny rancherias were actually purchased during this era?
We do not, and we must plainly state the disagreement in the historical sources here. There is no single canonical number of rancherias.
Why is it so hard to count them?
Because the records are messy. The sources commonly cite a range. Some historical overviews say 50-plus parcels were acquired for homeless California Indians across these appropriation years. Other, more detailed general histories push that number up to about 82 separate parcels.
It's a pretty big spread.
It is. And to add to the confusion, later on during the 1950s termination era, which is a whole different dark chapter where the government tried to end its relationship with tribes entirely, the ACCIP paperwork listed 41 rancherias slated for termination, and 38 were actually terminated.
Okay, so the numbers are all over the place.
Yeah. The numbers shift wildly depending on whether historians are counting original purchases, later executive order additions, or just what managed to survive in trust status until the 1950s.
And whether the number was 50 or 82 or 41, the pattern is identical. Scattered, tiny dots of poor quality dirt.
Exactly.
And we really need to emphasize what this meant on a human level. Being placed on marginal soil didn't just mean that farming was difficult. The cultural loss here is staggering.
It's immeasurable.
When you were given 88 acres of bad land, you are inherently cut off from your traditional hunting grounds. You are cut off from your historical gathering areas for acorns, which was a staple food source, and basket weaving materials.
Right. You can't just go forage on your neighbor's corporate farm.
Exactly. You are severed from your ancestral fishing waters. The home that Congress bought was, in many ways, a cage. It was a space to legally exist, but it systematically denied them the ability to maintain their expansive cultural traditions or their self-sufficiency.
Which brings us right back to the central paradox of this whole deep dive: containment and charity.
Right.
They were given a place to live so they wouldn't starve in the streets of white towns, which satisfied the reformers. But the place they were given ensured they could not participate meaningfully in the state's economy or maintain their historical way of life.
Which satisfied the state's economic interests.
Ugh.
Now, we've been talking extensively about the Northern California Indian Association, Charles Kelsey, and the congressional appropriations that ran from 1906 to 1933. That created the fragmented map in the north and central parts of the state.
Yes.
But there's a completely different legal track that happened in the South, right?
Yes, there is. While Congress was using those annual drip feed appropriations to buy tiny patches of bad land in the north and center, a completely different legal mechanism was yielding the exact same fragmented result in Southern California.
This was specifically for the Mission Indians.
Right. The mission bans.
So this Southern tract happened much earlier, didn't it?
It did over a decade earlier. In 1891, Congress passed the Act for the Relief of Mission Indians.
Okay, 1891, what did that act actually do?
This act authorized a specific dedicated commission to select and purchase lands and arrange settlements for the mission bands in Southern California.
And what was the practical result of that 1891 commission? Did they do a better job than the 1906 appropriations?
Over time, the 1891 Act produced 30-plus small executive order reservations.
Okay, wait, so you have a totally different law passed in 1891, driven by a specific dedicated commission dealing with a different cultural group of indigenous people in a different geographic region.
Right.
And yet it creates the exact same problem, 30-plus scattered small reservations instead of a cohesive, large, viable land base. Why did two completely different legal doors lead to the exact same fragmented room?
If we look analytically at the underlying philosophy of the federal government, the answer becomes starkly clear.
Lay it out for us.
Whether it was a dedicated commission in 1891 for the Mission Indians or an annual appropriation beginning in 1906 for the Northern bands, the federal mindset was identical. The overriding geopolitical goal was containment on land that white settlers didn't want.
Wow.
The legal mechanisms were different, but the strategy of the United States was exactly the same. Clear the valuable, fertile, resource-rich land for the booming white population, and quietly tuck the indigenous survivors into the geographic margins where they wouldn't cause trouble.
It's incredibly ruthlessly consistent when you look at it that way.
It is.
The physical size of these reservations, both north and south, created immediate, obvious problems for physical survival. But there was also a hidden legal trap built into the very smallness of these rancherias, a trap that would devastate these communities for generations.
Yes, you are talking about water.
I am absolutely talking about water, because land without water in California is just sand and rocks.
Pretty much.
Doesn't matter if you have 88 acres or 8,000 acres. If you can't water it, you can't live on it.
Absolutely. The water rights issue is perhaps the most insidious structural part of the Rancheria story. To fully understand it, we have to look at a massive piece of federal law from the exact same era.
Let's get into it.
In 1908, the Supreme Court issued a landmark ruling in a case called Winters v. United States.
Winters. If you study federal Indian law, this case is a massive deal.
It is entirely foundational. The Winters Doctrine established a very powerful precedent. When the federal government creates an Indian reservation, it implicitly reserves enough water to fulfill the purpose of that reservation.
Okay, that makes sense.
And crucially, the priority date of that water right is tied to the exact date the reservation was created.
Okay, I have to jump in here because on paper, this sounds like a massive, incredible legal victory.
It really does.
Think about our case study, the Elam tribe. The government explicitly bought them 88 acres for residential and agricultural use. So according to the Supreme Court in the 1908 Winters decision, if the government buys you land specifically for agriculture, they are legally guaranteeing you the water required to farm it.
That's the logic.
It sounds like the ultimate legal shield against drought and greedy neighbors.
On paper, in the pristine theoretical halls of the Supreme Court, it was a shield. It was based on what is called the trust responsibility.
Let's define that for a second, because trust responsibility gets thrown around a lot. What does that actually mean in a legal sense?
Think of it like a fiduciary duty. When the government takes native land and places tribes on reservations, it legally enters into a trust relationship, very much like a financial trustee managing an inheritance for a beneficiary.
So they have an obligation.
Yes.
Yeah.
The government is legally bound to act in the tribe's best survival interests. Buying them land with no water isn't just bad public policy, it's a legal breach of that fiduciary duty.
Okay, so Winters is supposed to enforce that.
Exactly. The Winters Doctrine was supposed to uphold that trust responsibility, but when that doctrine was dropped into the dusty, cutthroat reality of a California valley, it completely failed. The Winters Doctrine did not protect the California rancherias.
Why? If the highest court in the land says you have the water, how do you practically not have the water?
Because of the unique, complex, and fiercely competitive nature of California's state water regime.
State law versus federal law.
Exactly. California operates on a mixed, somewhat chaotic system of water rights. It recognizes both riparian rights, meaning you have rights if your land physically borders the water, and appropriative rights.
Appropriative rights. That's the famous first in time, first in right rule, right?
Yeah.
Can you break down how that actually functions?
Sure. Think of appropriative water rights like standing in line at a buffet. The rule is strictly first come, first served. Whoever diverts the water first and puts it to beneficial use gets the senior right to it. They get to fill their plate first, no matter what.
Okay, so timeline is everything.
Oh, yes. Now, think about the timeline and the size of the rancherias. The white ranchers got in that buffet line in 1851, right after those unratified treaties failed. They built their dams, they dug their irrigation ditches, they took all the meat and potatoes.
And the rancherias, where were they in line?
These parcels were purchased incredibly late, mostly post-1906. By the time the rancherias were created, they were placed at the very back of a 50-year-old line.
Oh, wow.
Senior non-Indian farmers and massive agricultural conglomerates had already locked up all the water flow and all the storage under state appropriative laws.
So there was nothing left.
Exactly. Even though the Supreme Court said the rancherias get a plate, state law ensured the buffet trays were already licked completely clean before the tribes could even step up to the table.
First in time. The tribes were physically there for thousands of years, but legally, under American law, they were 50 years late to the water line because the government delayed buying the land.
Precisely. And here is where the size of the land matters immensely. Because the rancherias were tiny, just a few acres, they had zero economic or political bargaining power.
Right. They can't fight back.
A 10,000-acre reservation has leverage. They can demand attention, they can hire lawyers, they can force the state to negotiate. An 88-acre rancheria with 134 impoverished people cannot.
They'd just get rolled over.
As a result, Winter's rights in California were asserted very late, they were rarely quantified by the courts, and they were applied incredibly weakly. The practical effect was that all the legal and physical bargaining power tilted permanently toward non-tribal agriculture.
Now, I know the sources mention a historical debate here about why this water failure happened so comprehensively.
Yes, there is a heavily contested concept here that historians continue to debate today.
What's the debate?
Was the failure of the Windsor Doctrine in California a strict legal inevitability because of the mechanics of state water law and the inherently small size of the parcels? Or was it due to pure, unadulterated administrative neglect by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who simply refused to spend the time, the political capital, and the money to aggressively fight for the tribe's water rights in court?
Knowing what we know about the BIA in this era, it's likely a toxic mix of both.
Most likely.
The state system was rigged, and the federal trustees who were legally obligated to defend the tribes didn't bother to fight the rigged system.
Yeah.
I want you to imagine this scenario for a second.
Go ahead.
Imagine being a family who has survived decades of unimaginable displacement. Finally, the government hands you a deed to a small farm. But written into the invisible fine print of that deed is a clause that allows your neighbor, the massive corporate farm next door, to permanently shut off your plumbing.
Right.
And the government lawyer assigned to protect you just shrugs and walks away. That was the Rancheria water trap. You had the land, but you had absolutely no power over the lifeblood required to make that land habitable.
It is a profound failure of the trust responsibility we just defined. The tininess of the rancherias was not just a housing problem, it was a permanent bargaining disadvantage, actively engineered into the landscape.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today.
We really have.
From the unratified treaties of 1851, the 20,000 landless people living on the margins, the moral crusade of the Protestant women of the NCIA, Charles Kelsey's alarming on-the-ground census, to Congress spending $5 a head on uninhabitable land with no legally protected water.
It's a heavy history.
Pulling all these threads together to answer the primary mission we set out at the beginning of this deep dive, I have to ask you point blank.
Okay.
Looking at Cornelia Tabor, looking at Charles Kelsey, looking at Congress and the BIA, was this entire Rancheria program an act of benevolence or was it an act of containment?
If we synthesize all the motives, the data, the legislative acts, and the horrific outcomes, we arrive at a measured, analytical conclusion.
Which is?
It was fundamentally both. You cannot untangle the charity from the containment.
Right.
It was genuine humanitarian relief. They were providing literal legal space for landless survivors who were starving. Without those purchases, however meager, the outcomes could have been total erasure for many bands.
They would have had absolutely nowhere.
Right. But the execution of that relief was done in the cheapest, most marginal way possible. It was explicitly designed to keep indigenous people out of the way of California's booming economic engine.
Charity and containment share the exact same price tag.
Beautifully put. The government bought just enough land to ease the conscience of the reformers, but deliberately not enough to empower the people they were supposedly saving.
So when you drive through California today, when you are driving up Highway 101, or you are out in the Central Valley, and you see signs for these small rancherias. A dot here, a dot there, nestled quietly between massive agricultural empires or creeping suburban sprawl.
Yeah, you aren't seeing massive contiguous reservations.
No, you are looking at the direct, physical legacy of a $100,000 check written by Congress in 1906 and a deliberate strategy of cheap relief.
That fragmented map you see today is the physical, enduring manifestation of turn-of-the-century federal policy.
It's incredible how history is just stamped right onto the geography we drive through every single day without realizing it.
It really is hiding in plain sight.
To quickly recap our journey, we started with the tragedy of the 1851 treaties that left a population homeless in their own land. We saw how the Northern California Indian Association and Charles Kelsey forced the government to look at the 20,000 landless people.
We walked through the 88 acres of the Yellum Purchase to see exactly how cheap the solution was.
And we explored how the Winters Doctrine offered a completely false promise of water to these tiny parcels.
And we saw how two different laws, the Mission Indian Act in 1891 and the Appropriation Act in 1906, ultimately created the exact same fragmented map.
Before we go, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over.
Oh, this is a good one.
We've talked extensively today about how the small size of these rancherias stripped away agricultural viability and water power. We focus deeply on the physical and economic traps.
Right.
But consider the political consequence of this map.
Yeah, the political angle is huge.
By scattering 20,000 people across 80-plus tiny, isolated, often uninhabitable parcels, instead of consolidating them into large, unified reservations, the federal government didn't just fragment the land. They deeply intentionally fragmented indigenous political power and unity.
That is so important to realize.
When communities are physically separated by miles of white-owned farms, fighting just to get water for 88 acres, it is incredibly difficult to form a unified political bloc to challenge the state or the federal government.
It keeps everyone isolated.
In many ways, the map we started this deep dive talking about, that murky, scattered, unclear map, set the stage for the devastating termination policies that would come knocking on those exact same rancheria doors just a few decades later.
It's a sobering thought, and it provides a vital lens for understanding the decades of struggle that followed.
We want to warmly thank you for joining us on this deep dive. The next time you look at a map of California or see a sign for a local rancheria, we invite you to remember the history behind those borders and to keep questioning the maps you see every day.
Thank you for listening.